Step into the Dramark, a place of rust and ruin. Your story of decadence and doom awaits. Discover your faction, confront the ruin, and find out what you do with the time you have left. Role-play in a gilded age, where upstairs-downstairs drama meets existential horror. Our Brilliant Ruin is live now on Kickstarter. Back it today.
Welcome, young Padawans! We're here to guide you through the rules for the brand new trading card game Star Wars Unlimited. Set in the world's most famous science fantasy universe, Star Wars Unlimited sees players take the role of characters old and new like Darth Vader and Cassian Andor. Star Wars Unlimited's basic rules will be familiar to anyone who has played Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, or another popular trading card game. Each turn, players spend resources to play cards from their hand to the table, looking to reduce the hit points of their opponent's base to 0 and claim victory. Those cards are packed full of familiar characters, places, and moments from the movies, giving Unlimited the feel of an epic lightsaber duel or space dogfight in the comfort of your own home. To play a game of Star Wars Unlimited, you and your opponents will need a playable deck to bring to the table. Each player needs their own, whether it's one they've constructed themselves or a pre-made starter deck that you can buy from your friendly local game shop. A Star Wars Unlimited deck can contain any collection of cards you desire as long as they follow the basic deck building rules. And don't worry if you're playing with a starter deck, they have built the deck following these rules for you already. First of all, a deck must have a leader and a base. These are special cards that are put onto the battle at the start of the game and dictate how your deck will play, as well as offering you unique abilities and determining your deck's color identity, which we'll get into later. The leader and base cards are not counted as part of your deck, so you won't be shuffling them in at the start of the game. Instead, they'll sit in the center of your board like so. Second, a deck must be made up of at least 50 cards. You can go over 50, but you have to have at least 50 for the deck to be legal. As your leader and base aren't considered part of your deck, you won't have them to add to your card count. Lastly, your deck cannot contain more than 3 copies of one individual card. No matter how much you like force choking people, only 3 of the cards in your deck can be called force choke. As this is a trading card game, pretty much everything you'll be playing the game with is represented by 1 or more cards on your table and in your deck. A Star Wars Destiny card looks like this. There's plenty of information on there that we'll be explaining as we go, but to kick things off, there's one thing that all cards in the game share. Outside of your leaders and bases, all cards in the game have a cost laid out in a yellow badge on the top left corner. This represents how many of your resources you'll have to spend to play this card from your hand. And whenever a card references a card's cost, this printed number in the top left-hand corner is what it'll be referring to. Every card also has 1 or more aspect icons underneath its cost, and that includes your leader and base, which should have a combination of 3 aspect icons between them. There are 6 aspect icons, each associated with a color and playstyle: Vigilance blue, Command green, Aggression red, Cunning orange, Heroism white, and Villainy black. While cards with any aspect icons can be included in your deck, cards with aspect icons that do not match your leader or base's icons cost additional resources to play. Each icon that doesn't match your base or leader requires an extra 2 resources on top of their regular cost. Note that this is per icon, so if multiple icons that don't match your leader or base show up on the card, you'll have to pay for each of them separately. Cards with aspect icons that match your leader and base cost the standard amount of resources as listed on the card. This rule is referred to as the aspect penalty. There's 3 types of cards that currently exist in Star Wars Unlimited, each with their own role to play in the game and ways in which they can be used. Let's go over all 3 and how they work, as well as how to read each card and play with them. Units make up the bulk of your deck and will be key to winning the game in Star Wars Unlimited. They represent the fighters, tacticians, and vehicles that will be pivotal to your efforts to destroy the enemy base. You can tell a card is a unit card by the bar at the very top of the card, just to the right of your card's cost. To the right of the unit marker, you'll also see either the word ground or space in its own bar, which gives us another important piece of information. In Star Wars Unlimited, players will be deploying their units to one of the theatres of combat, both with a ground war and a dogfight in space. These two locations represented by two lanes on either side of your leader. When you play a unit card, it must be played in the correct lane, either space or ground. All units have stats and information at the bottom half of the card. The most important bit of info for a character is their power and hit points, represented by the numbers inside these blue and red badges on either side of their rules text. The red number on the left-hand side is the unit's power, which denotes how much damage it can do when it attacks. The blue number on the right-hand side is the unit's hit points, how much damage they can take before they're removed from play. In between the power and hit points of each unit, you'll see a bar for that unit's type. This is a bar that's filled with one or more words that denotes the unit's type, like Underworld or Imperial. These cards don't have any effect in their own right, but sometimes other cards will reference them for targeting, like this Fleet Lieutenant, for example, that can give a unit extra power if they're a rebel. Lastly, we have the card's rules text. This is the part of the card that will explain any special effects that that card can give. Sometimes a unit will have an effect when you play them, preceded by the words on play. Sometimes they have static effects that are always active, like General Dodona here, who gives all our rebels a stat boost. And sometimes a card will have a keyword ability. These are abilities that show up a lot on cards, and therefore have their own name to make them easier to identify. We'll explain how these work later. Unlike units that come into play on their own, upgrades are cards that we can attach to units we've already played. They'll usually infer a stat boost denoted by the red and blue badges on the bottom of the card that show how they affect the attached unit's power and hit points, but sometimes they'll also have their own rules text and effects like a unit does. Luke's lightsaber, for example, shows us that it has to be attached to a non-vehicle unit, and that when we play it, we'll get an extra bonus if it's being attached to Luke Skywalker's card. Upgrades, like units, also have a type line, but this time it's found on the bottom bar of the card. All the relevant information for your upgrades is shifted to the bottom of the card, which means you can tuck it under the unit you're attaching it to not take up too much space on the board. Events are unlike both units and upgrades in that they don't stick around in play after you've played them. Instead, they do the effect listed on the rules text of the card, and then they're immediately placed into your discard pile. Events are the simplest cards to use as they simply tell you what you get when you play them, and then they're gone. Events also have their own type line, which is only referred to by other cards and has no effect on its own. So now you understand the cards and have your deck together, let's get into actually playing. For ease of explaining, we're going to run you through a two-player game, but we'll get into multiplayer modes later in the video too. First, you need to set up the game. To do this, both players place their base cards on the table facing each other. Then place their leader card below the base. Your leader starts the game on their non-unit side, represented by the horizontal side of their card. Next, you need to randomly decide which player will start the initiative, with something like rolling dice or flipping a coin. Whoever wins will take the initiative counter, and they get to go first when playing. Then, each player shuffles their deck and draws 6 cards into their hand. You can mulligan once by shuffling your whole hand into your deck and drawing 6 new cards, but after that you're stuck with whatever you have. From the cards in your hand, each player then chooses 2 cards and places them face down in their resource area to use as resources later on. Now you're ready to play Star Wars Unlimited. So each game takes place over a series of rounds, continuing back and forth until one person wins. During the rounds, there are 2 key phases, the action phase and the regroup phase. During the action phase, players take turns performing an action, starting with the player who has the initiative. These can be things like playing cards, attacking, using abilities, and taking the initiative, all of which we'll get into later. Players go back and forth like this, playing things one at a time until someone passes. Then the other person can continue to play as many extra actions as they like before also passing. Then you go into the regroup phase before starting a new action phase and doing it all again. Rounds repeat like this until one player's base loses its final hit point, meaning that player is eliminated and their opponent wins. So let's take a closer look at the actions you can do during your first phase. The main thing you'll be doing is playing a card. To do this, you need to pay its cost in resources, which is noted at the top left of the card. For example, 1 for this surgical droid. You exhaust necessary resources in your pool by turning them 90 degrees sideways, like tapping in Magic the Gathering, to show that they've been used. Like we talked about earlier, there are 3 different types of cards in Star Wars Unlimited: units, events, and upgrades. You can play any of these, but only one at a time. Units enter play exerted, so can't attack or use certain abilities until after the next regroup phase. You place a unit card in the appropriate play area, either ground or space, and they can only attack other opposing cards in those areas. You can also play your leader card as a unit by meeting the requirements of the epic action ability text, for example by having 6 resources in play for Luke Skywalker. You flip it and place it in the appropriate section, likely ground, but unlike other units they enter play ready, so can jump into fights the same phase. If they're defeated, you flip the card back to its original side and take it out of the combat area. You can still use the basic abilities on the card, but it can't be flipped and transformed again that game. Events are of course single-use cards that trigger their effect when played. Once they're being resolved, according to the text on the card, it's sent straight to your discard pile. Finally, upgrades can only be equipped to your units. They specify which units and the effect on the card, usually increasing strength or health and adding fun new abilities. You slide them under the unit you want to attach them to, keeping the rules text visible, and once that unit is defeated, it also heads to the discard pile along with the conquered card. The next thing you can do is attack, which is where you'll target an opponent's unit or base to deal damage. To attack with a unit, you exhaust it by turning it 90 degrees sideways, so any already in this state can't attack. You'll also need to remember that ground units can only attack other ground units and space units can only attack other space units, but any of them can attack the opposing base. It's worth noting that if any of your opponent's users in the same arena have the keyword Sentinel, you have to target that Sentinel unit before any other non-Sentinel ones in the opponent's base. Units with the keyword Saboteur can ignore the Sentinel keyword, however. And if the attacking unit has the Saboteur keyword, they remove any shield tokens on the targeted unit. If the attacker has the Restore keyword, the attacking player heals their base health by that amount of hit points. Any additional abilities triggered on attack now take effect too. And don't worry, we've got a full breakdown of all the keywords at the end of the video if you're feeling a little lost. Let's get back to the basics. During the attack, units deal damage equal to their power value to each other simultaneously. If a unit receives more damage than it has hit points, it is defeated and discarded to the player's discard pile. When attacking a base, the base takes damage equal to the attacker's power value, but the attacker doesn't get any damage in return. Another thing you can do during this phase is use an ability. You can activate the abilities on a card by paying the required cost and resources and/or exhausting those cards itself, depending on the specific rules of the text on each card. If the ability is labeled as an epic action though, as mentioned earlier, it can only be used once per game regardless of the cost. Lastly, you can also try to take the initiative during this phase. Taking the initiative stops a player from performing any more actions during the current action phase. They effectively pass for the round when they decide to choose that. Only one player can use their turn to take the initiative during the current phase. If the player already has the initiative token, they basically just get to keep it, ensuring they'll go first next time. But if the opponent takes it, it means they get to go first in the next round, which can be very helpful. Finally, the last thing you can do is pass the round. Once you feel like you've done everything you can, are ready to move on to the regroup phase, you can pass. This doesn't stop the other player though, so they can continue playing until they also pass. Once you've both passed the current action phase, it ends and you move on to the regroup phase. So, the regroup phase is basically a chance to refresh and replenish, following these steps in order. Draw a card. Both players draw 2 cards from the top of their deck. Add a resource card. Each player then chooses whether to add one from their hand onto their resource pile, placing it face down into the right area. If so, a maximum of 1 resource can be added each time in this phase, but players do not have to play a resource if they don't want to. The player with the initiative token decides whether to add a resource first, before their opponent performs their resource step. Ready cards. Both players ready any exhausted cards, turning them 90 degrees so they are upright once again. This allows cards to use their abilities and attack during the next action phase. Once the regroup phase is over, play returns to the next action phase, beginning with the player with the initiative token, and you basically repeat those steps. You do this back and forth until someone wins the game. To win a game of Star Wars Unlimited, you just need to reduce an opponent's base to 0 points. Each starts with 30 and you'll be gradually wearing them down over the game. Unlike many card games though, if a player exhausts their deck and goes to draw another card and they don't have any, they don't immediately lose. Instead, their base suffers 3 damage for each card they're unable to draw. So it will definitely wear you down, but it does mean you can hang on a little longer in a game. Star Wars Unlimited is simple enough once you get the hang of it, and the keywords are likely to be what stumps you at first. So let's quickly go over what each of them does. Ambush. Cards with the ambush keyword may immediately ready and attack an opponent's unit when played. If there are no enemy units to attack when the card is played, it cannot be ready and remains exhausted. Grit. Cards with the grit keyword gain +1/+0, gaining them an additional power for each point of damage they have. Overwhelm. If a unit with the overwhelm keyword attacks an opposing unit and deals damage in excess of that unit's remaining health, any excess damage is then dealt to the controlling player's base. Raid. Units with the raid keyword gain additional power when attacking, equal to the number noted next to the raid keyword. For example, raid 3 would grant 3 additional power when attacking. Restore. When a unit with restore attacks, the controlling player heals their base equal to that restore value. For example, restore 3 will grant 3 health back to that player's base. Saboteur. Saboteur units ignore the sentinel keyword on opposing cards, allowing them to freely attack other cards or the opponent's base and destroy all shield tokens on the unit they attack before dealing damage. Sentinel. If the card has the Sentinel keyword, attacking units in the same combat area, ground or space, must target that card before units without Sentinel or the player's base. If there are multiple cards with the keyword Sentinel, the attacking player chooses which unit to target. Shielded. When a unit with the shielded keyword is played, it gains a shield token. Each shield token prevents the damage of 1 attack. Remove the token when attacked and negate any damage. What we've described above is the standard rules for Star Wars Unlimited, also known as Premier. It's the default way to play with one single opponent and is the most common type of game you're going to encounter. However, Star Wars Unlimited has multiple official game mode variants that you can try out to mix up your experience. Chief among them is the Twin Suns variant that plays very similarly to a game of Commander for those familiar with Magic the Gathering. In Twin Suns, you'll construct a deck with 2 different leaders, both starting in play and both able to activate as normal. This gives you a much bigger potential pool for aspects to work with and more flexibility to deck build with. The twist is though, not only must your leader both share either the heroism or villainy aspect, but you can also have a max of 1 copy of each card per deck instead of the usual 3. That makes for a much more chaotic and interesting deck building experience, as well as more unpredictable gameplay. At the moment, Twin Sun decks are still a minimum of 50 cards, but as more cards and sets become available, that number will actually increase. You can also play Star Wars Unlimited in limited formats like Draft and Sealed, as well as at competitive events at your local game stores and internationally. If you want to learn more about Star Wars Unlimited, subscribe to the channel and head to our TikTok. or go over to dicebreaker.com, where we post daily news and updates on all things TCGs like this and beyond. Thank you so much for watching, may the force be with you, and have a lovely day.